The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Our guest today, Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman, will be talking about some of the initiatives of his office that apply to children and young people in the community. He'll be discussing the gun buyback program, the Juvenile Diversion project, and other educational efforts which relate to children and their families. Mike, it's a pleasure to have you here on All About Kids. And we'll be talking about some of the youth initiatives coming out of your county attorney's office, or ours, those of us who live in Hennepin County.
Absolutely.
I think you must be kind of unique in the history of Hennepin County attorneys and perhaps in the country, because from the very time you took office, children and young people have been one of your priorities, and you've been involved in some real innovative, not just punitive measures, but educational and things that help children and young people assume some responsibility for their actions. What are you proudest of?
Well, I think what we're proudest of is our Drop Your Guns initiative, which was in February and March of 1992. That was a gun turn-in program whereby we collected over 6,000 guns throughout different spots in Hennepin County. The program was focused on kids because we're saying kids and guns don't mix very well, that our young people ought to have other ways of solving their problems than reverting to violence. And we seized that opportunity to carry the message about nonviolence. And the young people of Hennepin County responded, and we took a lot of needless guns off the streets.
Did you talk to any young people who'd actually decided that this was the way they were going to give up their guns? Do you think they did it for the money, or do you think they really saw that it was something that they needed to do?
Well, we talked with number of our youth and our students prior to starting the program. We wanted to tailor it something that meant something to them. I hate to say, as I'm in my mid-40s, that I can't communicate with our young people as well as I'd like to think I can. But we spent a lot of time with focal groups before we started, and then followed up with those people after the program. I think what sold the program to our youth was no questions asked. That is, if the young person showed up at a firehouse, primarily in Minneapolis and a couple of firehouses in the suburbs, presented their gun, they got their $50 voucher back. Nobody asked their name, fingerprints. The guns were collected and then destroyed. No records were kept of what kinds of guns or the serial numbers. And by doing it that way, I think we engendered the kind of trust that our young people responded to, and that's why I think we got the number of guns we did.
You certainly must have cooperated with the police department when you were doing this. And had
wonderful cooperation with the police
support.
departments, both Minneapolis and throughout the suburbs. The fire stations in Minneapolis volunteered their time. We had old mailboxes there painted white, and that's where the guns went in. We picked them up every night, and they really cooperated, added to their workload, but everyone was committed to doing something to try to reduce the number of guns in the street and to preach the message of nonviolence to kids. You said it is a little unusual for a prosecutor, and that's my chief job, to be going out and kind of preventative measures trying to reduce violence. But I think that's among the responsibilities an elected prosecutor has, because if we can begin to reduce some of the cycles of violence, then we reduce the number of people the prosecutors see and the courts see and the prisons have, and I think that's all positive.
Well, as you said earlier, put you out of a job.
That's right, exactly. But well, I'm one of the few lawyers around who would like to work his way out of a job.
Well, obviously, kids don't just get to be teenagers and turn violent. What do you think some of the things that are going on in our community that are contributing to very young children who see violence as the only way of solving problems, even problems that don't seem to be too serious to us?
Well, it's clear that American society has always been a fairly violent one. We had the Wild West, and people carried guns then. We've kind of, in many ways, glorified violence through our media, both what we see in the TV news and what the movies and the comedy shows show. There's a tremendous amount of violence. There's violence in video games, and when we had the Gulf War and the news and watching, and it's kind of zap, you're gone and nothing really happens. It's also clear that violence is seen as a method of resolving problems, and it clearly isn't. So Drop Your Guns was just the beginning of a long-range initiative that we must all undertake. And that's initiatives in the schools, in the churches, in the civic groups, in the families first. If a young person is only seeing violence as a way of solving problems in their home, they're going to resort to violence on the streets. And the positive role models of parents and of other adults in resolving difficulties and conflicts without resorting to violence is a critical one. And that's one we need to work on real hard, all of us.
So you don't see the gun buyback program as just a one-shot deal. Do you have any plans for continuing or trying it again?
Well, yes, we do. And the turn-in program got a number of guns off the street, but that was just kind of a start. We're now preparing and hope to be in a number of our public schools in March with a play about nonviolence. It's a play about 3 young people who grew up together and lived in kind of a violent situation. They played cops and robbers when they were kids, and they end up having disagreements as they get to be teenagers, and the conclusion of the play is 2 of the 3 are shot and the 3rd's in a wheelchair. And it's a whole discussion, hopefully with dialogue and animation and discussions designed for our teenagers to talk about the roots of violence.
And this is being sponsored by the County Attorney's Office. Has anything like that ever been done before? An educational program in the school, that's fantastic.
Well, it's a little unusual for the Chief Prosecutor to do that, but you know, it's trite, but kids are our future. We were all kids once, and we have such great hope with young people to do that. And when we see young people's lives wasted because they don't see any way to work out their inner conflict short of violence, that's why we really feel that we need to carry the message directly to them. So our Drop Your Guns 1 program in February and March of '92 is now going to be followed in March of '93 with an education program talking about nonviolence. And if it's still in the formative stages, but if it's all put together, we'll have a study guide for students and teachers to be talking about what was the conflict they saw in the play. Are there better ways to resolve this? And to get that dialogue going. I think our youth are fertile fields to be worked with. I think they don't necessarily want to be violent to each other, but sometimes the violence seems to be the only way. If we can begin to show them other ways, we help to reduce the cycle of violence. That makes the streets and the neighborhood safer for all of us, and that's a social good, and that's something we ought to work towards.
Well, as you said earlier, if children don't ever see any other way of resolving problems, which kind of leads into the whole idea of domestic violence or child abuse, are you as the Chief Prosecutor addressing those issues too? In addition
Well, we're
to
deeply involved in prosecuting both domestic abuse and sexual abuse cases, and the County Attorney's Office under my predecessor led the cause for a facility called Corner House, which is a multidisciplinary center where children can come who they believe have been abused. They're interviewed with the use of closed-circuit TV. So I have one interview to find out what happened, and they use dolls and very sensitive investigators to do that. There's also a medical facility for them to be examined. Many times it doesn't lead to a criminal prosecution, but instead it leads to an understanding so social workers and people can work with the family to resolve that. That's a cutting edge thing here, and the concept really was devised after the tremendous problems in Scott County with the child abuse cases there. It's a better way to prosecute cases, but it's also a better way to find what is the root of the problem that caused it in the first place, and how can we go about solving that.
That certainly is the only practical way of looking at solving these problems. Again,
it's breaking
an innovative
the cycle.
approach.
It's breaking
right.
the cycle. If we see study after study, if a child was subject to domestic or sexual abuse as a child, they're very likely to repeat again. If we can get in and break the cycle early to show that young person there's a better way to provide the proper kind of training and medical care to the perpetrator, we can begin to break that. And what's often also happened in the latter part here of the 20th century is a lot of abuse and a lot of bad things in families that frankly never came out in public is now coming out. You gotta come out with it before you can begin to deal with it.
Parents are aware that it's no longer acceptable. Husbands, wives, the whole thing, because people are talking about it. I'd like to go back to something that you mentioned earlier. In talking about the gun buyback program, you mentioned focal groups from people in the community. Is that something that's done very regularly to try to get your constituents,
sure,
if you will, to
well,
talk about things that are important to them?
Right. You can't really begin to plan these kind of programs or provide the services to the million people who live in Hennepin County as the chief lawyer there if you don't get some feedback. And we found it very valuable to talk with youth before we put that program together. There was also a broad-based coalition that was the focus of Drop Your Guns 1, and now the second program starting in March of '93, in which we had community leaders from schools and churches and community organizations, police, firefighters, lawyers, judges, and about a 45-person coalition really put together the initiative for the initial gun buyback program, and now they're meeting again to try to help us put together this initiative for the information campaign in schools.
Did you have any reaction from some of the gangs that we hear about often in the media?
They were people who have been talked about in the media who are supposedly linked to the gangs who are involved in this. You need, if you're going to deal realistically with the problem that's in the streets, you have to deal with people who are purported gang members. Now, there's a lot of misinformation and non-information about gangs. Clearly, we have people who do link together and do commit violent crimes, and those people needed to be prosecuted. And we're certainly very involved in that, in prosecuting the people who murdered police officer Jerry Hoff and the witness Ed Harris, and we're being very aggressive about that. But there's also a chance there's lots of what we call wannabes and maybes and hanger-oners and could-bes, primarily younger people who may wear, quote, gang colors and may hang out in street corners, but they're not necessarily gang members and they're not necessarily involved in criminal activity. And we need to be able to touch and reach out to them to help push them away from crime. It's a tough balancing act.
Well, if kids have no alternative, and
Right.
the peer pressure is great to be part of a group, whether it's a gang or a club or an organization.
You know, it's a trade-off, and clearly our first and foremost job is to prosecute people who break crimes. And we do that, and we do that very vigorously with a lot of focus. But it seems to me if we're going to begin to reduce the impact of violence, we need to do these other measures as well. Some people are so bad, they just need to be off the streets for the rest of their life. And we prosecute those people, and I'm proud of the work of our prosecutors, and we take some people off the streets for a long time. But if it's the first time that a juvenile breaks a window, and he's kind of not sure why he did it, to throw him in jail for 6 months, I'm not sure solves the problem. And that's kind of why we started our Juvenile Diversion program. First-time offenders, property offenders, what we try to do is within a week of charging them, which is quickly after the incident, is to divert them away from the court system.
And these children could be as young or as old as they
Some of
could
these
be.
kids are as young as 12 and some old as 17. But if it's their first time in the system and if it's a property offense, what we do is give them an opportunity to make amends for what they did, to sign a contract admitting what they did was wrong, to pay back the damage that they did in some cases, and to agree to go to school. If they do that, and they follow that for 6 months, we'll wipe it off the slate. We won't prosecute them. They won't do jail time. And this is enough to scare a young person who may have done this, to do, frankly, what fathers and community leaders and pastors and scout leaders and things did to kids years ago, but we're trying to provide to fill that void.
Sort of a just type of discipline which helps a child learn some responsibility and that his actions have repercussions.
Absolutely. And the police, both in the suburbs and Minneapolis, have diversion programs. We've greatly expanded the one in Hennepin County. And we'll reach 1,800 kids in 1992 with it. Instead of clogging up the court system and waiting a long time and then maybe having too much punishment or not at all because the court system is too crowded. We're going to give swift, quick consequences to the kids. Now, we need to move in the other spectrum too. One of the other things that's bogging down the court system, but also, frankly, many times we're not dealing with well enough, is the really bad apple. The kids that commit murders or rapes, serious crimes, what we're working on is certifying them as adults. Move them out of the juvenile court system as well. If you kill somebody, pretty hard to see how the juvenile court system can deal well with you, and frankly, in most cases, they can't. Move them out, put them in the adult system, make them pay a penalty, have them do their schooling there, and recover. So it's kind of like bookends. We've got the more minor first-time property offenders, move them out, and like I said, about 1,800 in 1992.
Did you have any reaction from parents whose children were required to do those sorts of
Well, we insist that a parent
service?
or a guardian accompany the child for signing their diversion contract. We want parental involvement. The parents won't come, we won't divert the kid. They'll go in the court system. So a parent or a responsible adult. And the parents love it because they're saying all of a sudden Johnny has done this and they've been having trouble with Johnny. Now Johnny's got some consequences and someone else is trying to help discipline Johnny, but putting Johnny and his mom or dad or both, hopefully, together with the young man to say what you did was wrong. Now here's how you make amends, and it's not going to ruin you for the rest of your life.
Do you think what you are doing then helps parents reestablish an authority, not a negative kind of thing, but just parents say, hey, I can set limits. If the chief prosecutor can set these limits for my child, maybe I can too? Is that one of the things you'd like to see?
Well, sometimes it's just, a crisis in a family, in a person, kind of gives some warning lights, kind of tells you what's really happening with your family. Maybe you didn't know that Johnny, who was 14 when he was hanging out and wasn't at home, was kind of hanging around with the wrong kids. And they kind of egged him on to break Grandma Jones's window. And they shouldn't have done that. And it was kind of a dare. So what it is a chance for parents to get more acquainted with what the kid was really doing. And you're right. The parents can help make sure that Johnny fulfills his diversion contract and they start some dialogue. One of the wonderful things that came out of Drop Your Guns was the number of people who had dialogues, parents and kids, about guns. We had grandmothers coming in with sawed-off shotguns that they found underneath their granddaughter's bed. And in this case, when she confronted her granddaughter about it, she was keeping it there for her boyfriend. She's 15 and the boyfriend was 20, he had a sawed-off shotgun. And she and Grandma had a long talk and they came down to the police station themselves and turned in the sawed-off shotgun. We had other situations, isn't that a wonderful, a grandma and a daughter?
Oh, it is.
We had other father-son teams where they were literally having a discussion at dinner one night and the topic of turning in your guns came across the TV news. And the father said to the son, well, I don't know, you don't have any friends that have guns, do you? And the kid was real quiet. He says, what do you mean? And finally the kid acknowledged it. Yeah, he had a gun. He thought he needed it for his protection. Well, they talked 4 or 5 hours that night. They showed up at the firehouse at 8 a.m. the next morning and turned the gun in.
Do you have any negative response from some of the big lobbying organizations who are concerned about guns?
Well, some gun clubs people felt that we ought to inventory all the guns, go through all the serial numbers, see if the guns were stolen, and try to take the time to return them to their proper owners. They felt strong enough that they sued me and stopped me initially from melting down the guns. The court subsequently upheld my right to do that, and we melted them all down. And I got to tell you, one of the proudest moments of my life was when we threw 6,100 guns in a smelter, and it came out as liquid on the other end. They were concerned that we ought to look at, keep these serial numbers and see if we could return the guns to their rightful owners. We had talked with similar programs elsewhere in the country and found that very, very few of the guns that would be turned in had been stolen, and that often the rightful owners had already been compensated by insurance. It really was a tremendous administrative expense for little result. And so the coalition and I talked about it, and we agreed that we'd melt them down, because otherwise, if we kept any serial numbers, we weren't keeping our commitment to kids that said no questions asked. And when we talked to those kids, for one time, at least for a week, they believed us.
They could trust your office. I wish we could talk about that longer, but we've got a lot of topics to cover. What's the relation of your office with Hennepin County Juvenile Court? There's been some discussion about the need to look at the way children are tried, and you you alluded to that a little bit when you talked about the really serious offenders being tried as adults. You think there needs to be some reorganization?
Well, I think some steps are being taken now to expedite the process. Due process and giving a person a chance to respond to the charges that have been made against them is a very important constitutional and personal element in this country. But the juvenile court in many ways has been absolutely overloaded, particularly from the huge number of cases and the difficulty of working through them. We hope our diversion program, which will reduce approximately 8,000 cases we look at a year, most of which end up in the court system. If we can reduce that by 20%, that gives the court more time to do that. We've gotten some new judges there, kind of a commitment from the whole system to process and move things more quickly. If a certification hearing to certify youth as an adult and to try them as an adult takes 2 weeks, and it's interrupted 10 or 12 times for other hearings, that's not a very effective use of judicial or legal resources. So
or the kids' time.
Yeah, or the kids' time, and with some new judges in juvenile courts and the emphasis that we're placing in our office, and hopefully some additional help from the public defenders and elsewhere, we're going to try to expedite that system. Because we need, juvenile court's important to send messages to kids, and it's important to provide the proper due process. It's also important as a sentencing entity to make sure that kids who commit crimes pay a price.
Something that I know concerns people who work with youngsters and is when funding cuts are made. For instance, a young person is sent to the Juvenile Justice Center, the Juvenile Detention Center. The money for their school has been cut. I think there used to be contracts with Minneapolis school systems, so now many of those young people who aren't in their regular school are spending a lot of time doing not very much except being locked up. What do you think we need to do? I suppose it falls on taxpayers to say we want this money to go so that these kids get some kind of 6 or 8 hour schooling a day.
Well, every study and every person says that in order to have a chance of succeeding in this world, basic education is a minimum. And it's also a right of every kid to have that. Kids who are incarcerated need to have some kind of education. And I know that's a topic of intense discussion down the Juvenile Justice Center. We've tried to assist where we can to ensure that the kids get some instruction while they're there. Because if a kid has nothing to do except sit there with his feet up and watch TV, we're not going to do well. That is something that parents need to be concerned about. And you know, you need to be concerned about even if it isn't your kid, because if the kids aren't educated at the beginning, we're going to have to educate them sometime, or we're going to have to help finance them, or we're going to see them in jail. And so let's invest the money now, and let's give these kids a chance to thrive and to flourish.
That's important. I heard Judge Isabel Gomez speak about children in detention and said their souls are starved for literature or music or art, and that's sad to think about that. We don't have a lot of time left, and I think you need to tell us what your other future plans might be, some of the really crucial issues that you'd like your office to address.
Well, we're going to do our second gun initiative with youth. We're working real hard on some things on domestic abuse. How do we make sure that system is more user-friendly? People who have suffered abuse, it's bad enough they've suffered the abuse, but if they get bounced around between department and agency, we're working real hard on how we can make that more user-friendly. The same way we did a corner house for kids, why can't we assist, and we're working on that with a number of other groups to make the domestic abuse victims to have their process through the system be expedited and made easier. We've also taken a major initiative in terms of prosecution of gang crime. When people commit crimes in conjunction with other people, there are racketeering and conspiracy statutes. We're working on some things with legislators now, trying to make sure if you get together with your friends and decide to commit crimes, you're not only going to pay the price for the crime that crime you committed, but the fact that you did it in unity. We need to do that to provide some public. The final thing that I'm interested in spending a good deal of time is overall in the environment. All of us are more aware today than ever before of the importance of clean air and clean water. What we're really trying to do is to work with companies that pollute to encourage them not to. And if they don't listen to our encouragement, then we'll take them to court. And we've done that fairly successfully over the last 18 months, and we're going to keep doing that.
That has some definite implications for children, particularly those in the city who are exposed to high levels of lead and
Yeah, it
toxic.
does clearly in the city, but the air we all breathe, it has impact for kids, but for adults as well. And I think that's increasingly something government can do, and we're being much more aggressive on that.
I appreciate your interest in seeing the child or the young person in the context of the family and of society. Sort of, children are everyone's responsibility to help to raise, because they'll be taking care of us when we're in the homes.
Well, that's right. And we were all kids once. We can all point to someone who's made a difference in our life. People say, well, what can I do? We have studies show that kids in low-income neighborhoods who have had a tough time in life, a third of them will make it just because of their own sheer perseverance and strength. Another third will make them if people like you and I and our listeners invest in that child. Sometimes the investment can be as little as 1 day a week for 6 months. That'll help make that kid turn the corner and be productive citizens. So if people are asking what can they do, help in the boys club, help in the girls club, help in teen sports, reach out to somebody in your church or your school, and there are all sorts of numbers there. Or in your library, absolutely. And you do that, you can make an investment in a child, and you can make an investment in your future and everyone else.
Well, Mike, it seems to me like you're walking a very fine line, but a very good line between your role as prosecutor and your role in helping to prevent children from getting into the system. Thank you very much for being with us on All About Kids.
My pleasure.
Come back again.
I will.
Thank you.
Some good insight into how the Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman and his staff are approaching some of the problems of our society today. Thank you, Mike Freeman, and thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.